Today, we're looking at Flynn Archer, fired in front of his 6-year-old daughter for doing the only honorable thing possible. Simply speaking, truth. He stood under the harsh lights of the executive floor. He watched CEO Audrey Sinclair yank the critical file from his hands and shove it aggressively against his chest. Vital documents scattered across the floor like shattered trust. Her tone was a masterclass in toxic power, quietly elegant, devastatingly humiliating. What gives a man who can't manage his own life the right to tell me how to run this company? Little Bonnie shrank against her dad, gripping a faded stuffed rabbit. But Flynn held steady. Facing arrogance with calm resolve, he whispered, "By morning, you'll understand exactly who you just threw out of this building." Let's step back. Mercer's top floor was built purely to intimidate. Polished white stone bounced the overhead glare in icy, forbidding streaks. The air held a very specific heavy sort of chill, a dead silence meant for places where everyday employees weren't welcome. At 11:20 on a Tuesday night, true leadership failed there in a way nobody would ever forget. Flynn Archer stood dead center in that hallway, completely uninvited. Lacking executive rank, he was there because integrity demanded it. One arm held a file stuffed with system logs, sensor data, and critical error reports. Cradled safely against his chest was his 6-year-old daughter, Bonnie. Her small forehead was still warm from an evening fever. Little hands tightly gripped the worn, beloved stuffed toy she kept beside her every single night since she could barely grasp it. Now CEO Audrey Sinclair was someone who despised sudden disruptions. Marching from her strategy meeting, she was flanked by assistant Leo Bennett, alongside 2 senior directors and a pair of security guards. Exhausted from a long meeting, tomorrow's huge board presentation loomed. The very last thing she wanted tonight was a maintenance worker blocking her path with a child in tow and a thick stack of papers she never requested to review. She dismissed Flynn immediately, seeing an annoyance instead of a valuable team member trying to help. Flynn spoke calmly, showing true conviction. "I need 2 minutes. There's a fatal calibration flaw in tonight's outgoing thermal batch. Someone has falsified the logs. If that shipment leaves our docks, the company faces absolute ruin." Audrey completely ignored the vital warning he was handing her. She judged purely by superficial appearances. She merely saw a blue-collar worker in worn clothes, clutching a feverish kid on a corporate floor they supposedly didn't belong on. "This executive level is not a daycare," she snapped. "And I don't take operational advice from people who can't sort out their personal calendar." Blinded by ego, she snatched the folder straight from him, flipped 2 pages without actually looking, then aggressively shoved it back into his chest. Critical corporate data spilled across the floor in slow motion. Little Bonnie flinched, her eyes growing wide. In the heavy silence, the young girl stared up at this terrible boss, who had just physically degraded her dad. "Stick with me," her tiny voice was about to stop that arrogant hallway completely cold. "Daddy, did I make you get in trouble?" Not one person moved. You and I would have seen a secretary quietly drop her gaze. Henry Cole, watching from down the hall, took a slow step back, pretending he hadn't seen this arrogance. Flynn crouched slowly. He shielded little Bonnie, gathering those discarded papers together. He never raised his voice. He stood tall, looking straight at the arrogant executive. He spoke with the calm of a man who truly understood the stakes. "If that shipment leaves tonight, by morning you will regret ignoring the very pages you just threw on the ground." Blind to her mistake, Audrey faced a guard. "Flynn Archer is fired, effective right now." "Collect his badge." Knowing his own worth, Flynn removed it. He handed it over to the officer with total dignity. He gently guided Bonnie's shoulder and walked toward the elevator. The staff parted in that heavy silence, knowing they had just watched a leader fail completely. They had just witnessed a moment they would never forget. Before those elevator doors shut, he spoke once more, plainly and clearly, making sure Audrey heard him. "Tomorrow morning, you will realize what it costs to look at a person and see absolutely nothing. Let's rewind 6 hours. You and I would just see a dad keeping his child warm. His mornings always began the exact same way. Awake at 5:45 before Bonnie stirred. He carefully measured out his coffee, his single daily luxury allowed without a drop of guilt. Sliced bananas sat next to water and a single dose of children's ibuprofen. left out in case her fever spiked again. A bright yellow sticky note clung to the fridge door. Check the bag, keys, and health insurance card. Flynn knew true strength meant building structure, not just habits. It was pure survival. His wife Clara passed 3 years ago. The situation was the tragic sort that leaves behind messy grief. A routine hospital visit became a string of fatal errors, spotted early on but completely ignored. His broken family spent 8 heavy months filing official complaints only to get automated replies back. Flynn was 26, sitting in that sterile waiting room while little Bonnie slept on his lap. When a cowardly doctor, unable to look him in the eye, came through those doors. He never went public about the tragedy. He refused to sue. Instead, he did something much quieter and infinitely more impactful. He studied why corporate systems broke down in real life. He tracked exactly how critical warnings were brushed aside and buried, how vital records changed, and how the workers nearest to the actual problem had absolutely no power to fix it. Following Clara's death, he spent 2 years consulting for companies desperate to uncover the truth. He would read a business inside out, spotting the toxic rot before a public scandal hit. He was incredibly skilled at this. Then, speaking with a CEO named George Whitmore, he took on a very different kind of job. Because you and I know true leaders watch from the bottom, seeing what actually happens. For Flynn, responsibility meant a very simple apartment. In a quiet neighborhood with free parking, just 3 blocks from the local grocery store. His paycheck barely covered the rent, childcare for Bonnie, and little beyond that. It meant pressing his same 4 work shirts every single Sunday night, accepting reality. Accepting that his old car knocked loudly in the winter, a problem he delayed fixing. It also meant his daughter Bonnie daily, complaining his coffee smelled like dirt, demanding sweet strawberry jam on her toast instead of apricot. A true leader at home, he embraced these sacrifices completely. Then came that Tuesday. Bonnie spiked a slight fever, prompting her normal sitter to cancel abruptly at 4 that afternoon. His backup sitter was completely unavailable. Daycare closed at 6. He had only one real choice. Bring her to work, keep her safe, and let her rest in the break room while he finished up. Out of sheer dedication, he checked the outgoing shipping logs that night. He always paid attention to details others often ignored entirely. Let's look at the critical problem he simply couldn't ignore. A major delivery was set to leave the dock at 11:55. A massive pallet of thermal sensors destined for a regional medical supplier. A distributor supplying 14 hospital cold storage sites across 3 entire states. This contract was among the company's most vital active accounts. It brought in so much quarterly revenue that management had flaunted it during the last 2 board presentations. Flynn pulled the departure manifest at 9:48. Within 4 minutes, he spotted a glaring red flag. The sensor batch calibration log revealed a response delay missing acceptable safety limits by a factor of 1.4. Hardly a disaster in standard conditions. But within a medical cold storage supply chain, where the line between a functioning climate unit and a broken one determined if crucial medications stayed safe or completely spoiled, a failure nobody would notice until a patient was given ruined, dangerous medicine. 1.4 was a risk no ethical leader could ever ignore. He verified it against their internal quality servers. The original warning report was sitting right there, stamped at 6:11 that afternoon, awaiting management review. Yet the version in the chief executive's queue showed that exact batch, secretly approved and cleared. That clearance timestamp was just 14 minutes later. The software automatically locked the document for that specific cycle. Somebody altered the approval status well after the window shut. Flynn spent 12 minutes tracing this corruption across 3 separate logs. His instincts were dead on. He phoned Henry Cole while his daughter slept on 2 push chairs, her stuffed rabbit tucked neatly under her chin. Henry picked up on the 4th ring, sounding incredibly defensive immediately. And he grew increasingly evasive as their tense call continued. This is where you and I see the real failure. Management forced the schedule forward anyway. He cowardly repeated the excuse, "Not my call," 2 times. You and I know he never denied that calibration risk surfaced internally earlier that week. Flynn desperately tried 2 other channels. Both brushed off a highly valuable employee. No manager wanted the risk of signing a stop order on a massive shipment right before a board meeting where the CEO demanded total control. He stood in the dim break room, watching his little girl breathe, a father in a tough spot. He thought about Claire. He remembered those cold form letters. He weighed the heavy burden of knowing. A disaster was brewing, yet choosing silence just to play it safe. So he grabbed the report, gently lifting his sleeping daughter into his arms. And he marched toward the elevator, heading to the executive floor, where he technically did not belong. This wasn't about him trying to play the hero. He did it because staying quiet meant repeating a tragic failure he'd already survived once. And he absolutely refused to let that happen ever again. Audrey Sinclair had run Mercer Industrial as CEO for 22 months. In all that time, she mistook absolute stubbornness in front of her staff for actual leadership. She believed real leaders never hesitated. To her, keeping power meant crushing any pushback from employees who sat far below her on the corporate ladder. She learned this toxic management style early, applied it constantly, and thought it worked. At 28, she had a sharp mind that made some folks blindly follow her every single command. She grew up fighting to be smarter, moving much quicker, and outsmarting everyone around her just to earn a shred of respect. She succeeded so thoroughly that she completely forgot true leadership requires empathy, letting her entire personality slowly harden around that old need for dominance. She wasn't born a cruel person, but sadly she learned to mistake blind cruelty for strong leadership. Let's look at what happened next. Leaving her strategy meeting, she spotted Flynn holding his sick daughter and a vital report right there in the executive hallway. She felt zero curiosity about him. She only saw a security failure that needed immediate fixing, and she planned to punish whoever let him upstairs tomorrow morning. She heard his words but totally failed to truly understand the situation. His voice stayed incredibly calm. His warning was perfectly clear. He delivered the difficult news like a true, grounded professional. No panic, no dramatic performance. But she'd already unfairly judged his true worth as an employee. Just a stressed, underpaid night worker bringing his sick kid upstairs. Once she wrote off his value, his urgent business-saving warning just turned into annoying background noise. When she rudely tossed that folder back at him, she did it like always, coldly efficient, completely blind to the human cost. It was the practiced move of a boss who fired people without a second thought. Eliminate the immediate problem. Clear the room, march blindly ahead. But her fatal leadership flaw ignored one crucial detail, Bonnie. You see, that little girl's voice breaking the silence after the papers fell was the quietest, most heartbreaking sound anyone in that toxic corporate hallway had heard in years. There was zero performance in it. She wasn't faking her deep distress. Just a 6-year-old trying to figure out if she had accidentally ruined her dad's career, which showed the absolute purest form of a child's unwavering devotion. It struck that bright, sterile office space like a heavy rock hitting dead water. The CEO felt the room shift completely. She noticed people drop their fake distractions, while Leo Bennett froze entirely, sensing a complete failure of leadership unfold beside her. And how those two department heads suddenly decided the ceiling was fascinating to stare at. She felt the tension, processed it poorly, and made a terrible short-sighted choice. This was merely emotion. Emotion wasn't hard data, move forward, done. Flexing her empty authority, she ordered his security badge stripped away. She watched this valuable employee calmly guide his daughter down the hallway, never breaking, denying that arrogant boss even a single second of visible surrender. Retreating to her office, she blindly convinced herself the problem was fully handled. The rain was pouring much harder when this loyal father finally reached the garage. He strapped Bonnie into the back, adjusting the vents to blow warm air her way. Then he just sat up front, engine off, letting the heavy reality sink in. Bonnie stayed quiet for a long while. Then, using that tiny fragile voice kids have when fighting back tears over grown-up mistakes. Daddy, was it because I came along? Did I ruin things? Flynn slowly turned around. He studied his precious daughter and her tearful red eyes. Her stuffed rabbit hugged tightly against her. Her pure 6-year-old guilt, believing she caused a cruelty that true leadership should have prevented. No, he stated plainly. It was the only honest tone that brave girl would accept. You did absolutely nothing wrong. My boss made a bad error and I tried to warn them. That is all, but she was acting so mean. She was, he answered. Some managers act tough when they panic. Bonnie thought about that. Is she scared? She will be, he replied softly, before tomorrow morning hits. He let Bonnie's breathing calm down until she slept, then flipped his laptop open right there. What happened next took 47 minutes. Stick with me here. You would have seen a man in that garage typing with the cold, sharp efficiency of an undervalued expert who truly understood this complex corporate system. Never rushing, never fumbling, perfectly confident in his own immense value. He knew exactly which data files to grab and the perfect order. He found the specific log proving her unauthorized edit window violation. He grabbed the email thread exposing Audrey's actual words, capturing her reckless directive from an internal call. Never let the honest truth ruin a perfectly clean financial quarter. He quickly compiled the real calibration report, the faked clearance document, and that glaring edit timestamp violation. Let's look at the toxic leadership chain crushing 3 management levels. He detailed his wrongful termination, carefully listing every single witness in the room. Then he opened a secure encrypted channel untouched since his very first week at the Mercer Corporation. He sent the message straight to George Whitmore, copying Andrea Wells. 4 paragraphs in total, every piece of proof was attached. The final sentence took 3 rewrites, though true leadership meant trusting his gut, and he eventually stuck with his very first draft. I am not asking to be reinstated. I am asking that this company not become the kind of place that the people who built it swore it would never be. He hit send, shut the laptop, tilted his head back, and just listened to the falling rain. His phone screen flashed once on the passenger seat. Email delivered. He finally shut his eyes for the first time in hours. Little Bonnie stirred in the back. Real value lies in caring for others. He blindly fixed her blanket, sitting frozen until the sun came up. Audrey Sinclair sat in her penthouse, 41 floors up. At 12:30 a.m. she stood by the massive windows. A glass of wine sat right there, completely ignored. She stared at the city lights. Her usual routine for making executive decisions when no one was around to judge her. The crucial board presentation glowed on her open laptop. These metrics were precisely what the corporate council demanded. Her pitch for total operational control was completely airtight. She had practiced the pitch so much she could recite it in her sleep. Just before midnight, Leo Bennett had texted her a question. Everything okay with the Archer situation? She replied with 2 arrogant words, handled it, then slapped her phone face down. A sudden calendar alert hit at 12:52 a.m. An emergency board meeting was set for 7:45 the next morning. Every single executive officer was ordered to be there. She tried convincing herself it was standard procedure. Just pre-session alignment before the big formal review. You and I know she hoped Whitmore's team was just doing their usual excessive paperwork. She reviewed one last slide, then snapped the laptop shut. She paused by the glass right before killing the lights. Her own cold reflection stared back from the window pane. For just a split second, she faced a truth she had ignored for a long time. The young woman who joined Mercer 6 years ago, armed only with a sharp grasp of corporate risk, and a real beating heart that wanted to build a better workplace culture. The 22-year-old girl who had once sat down with men twice her age and bravely refused to apologize for being the smartest person in the room. We see that old version of her actually valued people. Audrey held on to that empathy for 3 seconds, then tossed it away like every other inconvenient human emotion. A cold, calculated choice to shut off her own humanity. She simply switched off the light. Across the city, George Whitmore finished Flynn's email. You and I know true leaders actually listen. He quietly set down the document. He looked across the table at Andrea, saying simply, 7:45. We do not wait anymore. The sky was damp and gray when Audrey arrived at the Mercer building at 7:20. News of her reckless firing of Flynn had already infected the workplace culture. Bad leadership travels silently, with zero formal announcement, moving faster than memos. By the time she stepped into the lobby, she could see the subtle, fearful ways employees adjusted when she walked past. people dropped their eyes a fraction of a second faster. A maintenance supervisor suddenly found something incredibly fascinating to inspect on the blank wall as she passed. She noticed completely missed the real lesson and took the elevator. The 43rd floor boardroom was entirely different from the compliant space she expected to see. Corporate security was much heavier than usual. Andrea Wells sat waiting, a glass of water and a thick management report ready. Constance Reed, who rarely showed her face before 8:15, was waiting at the far edge of the room. She scrolled her phone with that blank, intensely focused look, the icy look that meant her final judgment was locked. And right at the head of the table, in the exact executive chair Audrey arrogantly assumed he had retired from, sat George Whitmore himself. He looked a bit older than the last time she saw him face to face, but his solid posture proved he had not come to this meeting to play the weak founder. And his eyes, locking onto hers, were completely unshakable and calm. Audrey started a fake greeting, then froze when she spotted the man sitting opposite the boss. It was Flynn Archer, wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored dark gray corporate suit. He sat up straight, poised and totally natural. His hands rested calmly on the wooden table, under the cool, controlled lighting of the executive suite. He looked like he truly belonged there. Suddenly, Audrey realized she lacked that very same value. She stopped dead. Why is this fired man here? She forced her voice steady, asking a question but throwing down a blind, arrogant challenge. George did not reply right away. He just raised a hand to shut the door. Nobody bothered to offer Audrey a chair. You and I can see her illusion shatter. This was no friendly corporate alignment meeting. Everyone in this leadership team had arrived long before her. They had reviewed company files she never even saw, and they stared at her with that heavy silence, meaning a final justified verdict was already reached. And all that was left was the execution. George Whitmore folded his hands. His voice had the calm, heavy weight of true authority. A boss who understood the situation perfectly and was finally stepping in to protect his people. Last night you fired the one true person in this entire company who put safety above his own career. It's time you and I understood who he really was. George spoke without drama. Real leaders never need cheap tricks. 6 months before Flynn showed up on Mercer's maintenance schedule, the board received warning signs a wise leader wouldn't ignore. Voluntary resignations across the quality control and safety testing divisions had skyrocketed 18% in under a single year. 3 separate anonymous complaints through the employee ethics system described, in different words but with exact matching details, a clear pattern of forged documents and hidden safety warnings on outgoing products. Yet every formal audit that followed returned completely flawless results. That alone was a massive red flag, prompting George to consult Andrea Wells to understand what it really meant. It meant someone was hiding the truth before the auditors even got there. Someone with executive power was secretly tracking the audit schedule. Sending in a regular outside auditor wasn't an option. Let's be honest, external audits just warn bad managers weeks in advance to hide their mess. They needed someone who could slip into the ranks at a level so low bad bosses wouldn't notice. Understand the real situation on the floor, ignoring the polished lies management usually presented, and stay embedded there long enough to dig up solid proof that could survive legal scrutiny. They required someone fluent in both the heavy machinery itself and the invisible, quiet tragedy of a failing corporate culture. The exact way lazy leaders excuse warnings, push them upward, and bury them. George recognized the true value of one specific man. Flynn Archer had spent 3 painful years after his wife died, doing exactly this kind of deep work, helping struggling companies spot and remove the specific points of danger that bad managers ignored until a fatal disaster struck. Eventually, for his own deeply personal reasons, he abandoned that corporate world completely. A wise leader, George called him personally. Flynn only accepted the job with one rule: that he hold the ultimate power to report straight to the board via a secure line the second he found the truth he needed. A failsafe that completely bypassed the arrogant managers entirely, just in case those managers were guilty. He spent 7 quiet months at Mercer. He worked the night shift. He ate his meals in the cafeteria. He fixed conveyor belts, faithfully updated logs, and never gave those out-of-touch executives a single reason to see the brilliant mind working right beneath them. Until that fateful night when his choice was to step up or let the same blind corporate negligence that killed his wife repeat itself inside a different building. Flynn finally spoke once, very briefly. His tone held that same steady gravity from the parking garage and the polished executive hallways. You know that voice, a man with nothing to prove, who simply valued real truth. "I didn't send that email to take you down," he said, staring right at Audrey. "I forwarded it because you chose to. Silence the warning instead of reading it. And somewhere in that silent building right now, traumatized staff watched what happened last night and learned that telling the truth gets you fired. That is the toxic culture you've built. That is what I came to find." Audrey said nothing. The color in her face didn't vanish so much as sink deeper, leaving the pale shock of a leader finally realizing that her ruthless power to fire was truly being weighed. George watched her in absolute silence. "Today, Audrey, we are not reviewing the shipment, we are reviewing you." Andrea Wells handed over the evidence without dramatic flair or judgment. "You and I know cold facts hit harder than any dramatic corporate tantrum ever could." The giant screen at the end of the room displayed the true calibration log for batch D14 beside the altered version. The glaring timestamp discrepancy sat 4 lines down. It wasn't subtle at all, it needed no interpretation. The damning email chain came next. An 11-day internal thread where multiple management layers were repeatedly warned about safety. In increasingly urgent, pointed language. That quarterly shipping targets were absolutely non-negotiable, and that any verification delays would trigger an immediate accountability review. That chilling threat had not been aimed at the safety team because they failed to find problems. It targeted them for caring too much and finding real problems. The recorded phone call played third, then Leo Bennett was escorted inside. He just stood there, hands pinned to his sides. When Andrea asked him to verify that the angry voice on tape belonged to Audrey, he paused just long enough to accept that shielding a toxic boss who devalued people would never save his own career. And then finally he confirmed it. They reached Henry Cole by phone, asking for a brief, honest verbal statement. His voice coming through the conference room speaker sounded totally unsteady. He verified that on 2 distinct occasions during the very last month. He flagged the bad calibrations to his direct boss only to be told that safety findings must be manipulated to reflect acceptable, profitable operational parameters. He never told the board because he knew they rarely understood the situation or valued their people enough to care. Audrey desperately attempted 3 weak lines of defense during the painful course of this presentation. She claimed she never personally ordered the critical documentation to be faked. She swore her intense pressure was about speed, never about suppressing the honest safety findings. She argued that Flynn speaking up, regardless of technical proof, was a rogue action taken completely without respect for corporate protocol, and bringing his little girl to the executive floor in the middle of the night was just cheap emotional manipulation designed to ruin her authority. Constance Reed, who stayed perfectly quiet through this entire failure of leadership. Let's pause here. She looked up from her tablet and asked just one question. She asked it coldly, like a purely technical business inquiry. Let's look at this together. If the person in that hallway was a 50-year-old vice president in a tailored suit, she asked, would you have actually thrown the folder at him? The question hung there. Audrey just sat in total silence. She couldn't answer without exposing her utter lack of empathy. And she was way too calculated to try and fake an answer that clearly wasn't true. So she said absolutely nothing. Her silence proved she lacked basic situational awareness. Then Flynn quietly added one single sentence. No grandstanding, no bitterness, just a true leader stating a cold fact. Any business can survive a bad quarter, he pointed out. But almost no company survives a workplace where the people spotting real problems are terrified to speak up. George finally asked Audrey to step outside into the hall, so the board could formally vote. She stood by the glass walls, staring at the city below. A city moving through Tuesday morning, totally blind to the massive shift in power 43 floors up. The deep anxiety of not knowing what was being discussed behind closed doors was totally new to her, She had never felt that powerlessness here. She had always been the one calling all the shots. The person whose exit from any room was only ever a temporary thing. For the very first time, she just wasn't certain. Inside, the board's discussion was calm and relatively quick. George highlighted company culture, stressing the massive cost of ignoring difficult truths from people without real corporate power. Andrea broke down the severe legal risks that would hit them if the shipping crisis leaked without a solid plan to fix it. Constance Reed then asked Flynn three very direct questions about what his interim operational plan would require. Flynn answered them all with that same clear practical logic he had used for everything else over the past 12 hours. He said he'd take the temporary job on three conditions: a complete outside review of who altered those official documents, ironclad protection for any worker pressured to hide the real findings, and fixing the reporting structure, ensuring safety warnings from any staff level could reach the board directly without management burying them. He framed these as non-negotiable demands. True leadership meant protecting your people and fixing the system. Constance Reed cast her yes vote before George even finished summarizing the motion on the table. When they finally called Audrey back inside, George broke the news in a calm, steady voice, completely certain but never cruel. Audrey Sinclair was stripped of her title, effective immediately. Flynn Archer was named acting chief executive for 90 days. Time enough to run the independent audit and find a permanent leader who actually valued their people. Audrey stood perfectly still while he laid it out. There was absolutely nothing helpful she could say now, and she was too calculated to waste breath on a situation she had already completely lost. So what do we learn here? Leaving that room, she walked that hallway, realizing it too late. Andrea Wells had sat with little Bonnie for nearly an hour right out there. The small girl was curled on the couch, hugging her stuffed rabbit close. She sketched with that pure focus children find when they decide the harsh adult world simply is not their problem right now. Watch as Flynn steps out 30 seconds later. Bonnie looked right up at him with the only question that meant anything to her. "Daddy, are you still fired?" Flynn gently sat down beside her. You could see the crushing exhaustion of the past 8 hours on his face, but only for the exact second it took him to smile. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "I just have a different office now." Bonnie thought about that for a second, then went right back to her coloring. And nobody in that corridor dared to look at them with the harsh judgment they had shown just the night before. Flynn Archer's first actual day running things as interim CEO did not start with grand speeches or PR meetings with the corporate communications team. It started when he halted the outgoing batch D14 at 6:48 in the morning, freezing all related units until an outside technical team could verify their safety. By 9 a.m., he filed a formal request demanding an independent investigator within 72 hours, given absolutely unrestricted access, reporting findings straight to the full corporate council, bypassing the old executive office entirely. By 10:30, he pushed an internal memo to all department heads declaring that the company's safety and ethical reporting framework would be completely rebuilt over the next 30 days. Any new reports filed would now go straight to a board-level compliance officer for review. The executive suite was officially cut out of the review chain entirely. He finished the notice with just one powerful sentence beneath his signature. No employee at Mercer should ever have to choose between doing the honest thing and protecting their own family. You and I know that message moved fast because truth always resonates deeply with the people reading it. Down in the records department, a clerk who filed 2 safety warnings last year and got completely ignored read his words 3 times over. Out on the loading dock, a shift supervisor who saw Henry Cole dodge calibration issues for nearly a month read the email just once, very slowly, and just sat with the reality of it. As for Henry Cole, he sent Flynn a brief email late that morning. He apologized deeply for failing to speak up about it sooner. He labeled his own actions as cowardice, clearly choosing that heavy word with painful intent. Flynn answered with just 2 sentences. He wrote that the corporate structure Cole was trapped inside had been purposefully built to make absolute silence feel like the only safe choice. Starting today, it no longer was. Let's look inside that corner office Audrey Sinclair ruled just 24 hours earlier. Flynn labored all afternoon, the sleeves of his dress shirt rolled practically to his elbows. A cold cup of coffee by his side, 3 open documents spread neatly across the desk, moving with the quiet focus of someone who was never once confused about the real difference between authority and power. Late that afternoon, Bonnie finally drifted off on a small couch, moved into that very room just for her. Her toy rabbit tucked tightly beneath one arm. Flynn quietly stood, draped his jacket over his daughter, and went back to work. Meanwhile, former CEO Audrey Sinclair quietly packed up her desk that same early afternoon. No grand farewells, no crowds gathered to watch her leave. The corporate office simply offered the heavy silence of a workplace that had already moved on. Let's be honest, that silence hurt worse than shouting, because it gave her absolutely nothing left to fight against. Just the cold reality of the toxic workplace culture she built. Making her way toward the elevator, carrying a single cardboard box of personal items. She walked right past the open doorway of the executive suite she once commanded. Inside, she spotted the very man she fired, quietly reviewing paperwork. Behind him lay his sleeping daughter on the couch, that toy rabbit tucked safely away. She noticed his suit jacket gently draped over the little girl. A simple, effortless act of care from a dedicated father who never broke his focus. Audrey froze there for just 3 or 4 seconds. Then the elevator doors opened and she stepped inside. Outside the glass, the city glowed brightly as the late afternoon shifted into evening. High up on the 43rd floor, Flynn Archer handled the business while Bonnie slept. The peace filling that space was the rare kind of calm that takes years to earn. You and I have seen people pushed down so far that when they finally rise, the room simply doesn't recognize them. Flynn didn't have to fight his way back. By simply speaking the hard truth, even when it cost him absolutely everything, he arrived exactly where true integrity had been pointing him all along. What the employees of Mercer Industrial Systems would actually remember. Long after those quarterly reports and independent workplace investigations faded away, wasn't just that their ruthless chief executive got fired. It was how the man treated like the least important employee in the entire building walked in the next morning, using the very first hours of his new authority to ensure no future worker would ever have to face the impossible choice to choose between acting with integrity and staying safe. See, this was never just a story about losing authority. It shows us what true leadership is actually meant to protect.